The third limb of the test, the third part of the test of frustration, states that it can only be frustration if the event that has occurred means that performing the contract would be something different altogether from what had been contracted for. So this brings us back to the radical change in the obligation. The obligation itself has changed. So the second test, the second part of the test, deals with a radical change in the circumstances, and the third part deals with the radical change of the obligation to perform whatever was contracted for. We have a number of cases that we can look at in terms of examples of the application of this third part of the test. In ocean tramp tankers and Sofracht, a case which we can just call by the name of the ship involved, again another shipping case, the Eugenia. This case was about a ship that was to sail from Genoa to India. There's two ways of doing that, either through the Suez Canal, or the longer way to do that, the longer path, is past the Cape of Good Hope, so around Africa, which of course takes longer and is more onerous. At the time, there was impending war, there was the Suez Crisis, and nonetheless, it was decided by the charterers to take the Suez Canal route. As it happened, while the ship was in the Suez Canal was closed and the ship was impounded. The charterers then tried to use the doctrine of frustration to say that the contract for carriage of goods had been frustrated. The owners of the goods did not agree. The court held that since another option had been available, since the ship could have sailed around Africa, this meant the contract had not been frustrated. In other words, the Suez Crisis might have meant that there was a change in circumstances, but there was no change in the obligation, and it was nonetheless possible to perform that obligation. It would have just been more onerous. Something similar happened in British Movie to News and London District Cinemas Limited. You'll notice this case predates Davis Contractors. And even though it does not spell out the three-part test we're learning about, which came out of Davis Contractors, the decision in British Movie to News very much aligns with the ratio of the later case of Davis Contractors. What happened in that case was that the cinema company had contracted with the news company to produce short newsreels which would be shown ahead of cinema screenings. This was very popular during World War II because going to the cinema was one of the main outlets for people to be able to see video of what was going on in the war. Other than that, people basically listened to the radio. However, the war obviously came to an end in 1945, and suddenly these news clips were no longer as popular as before. The cinemas felt that the contract had been frustrated by the fact that the war had ended. Again, the court held that even though there was a change in circumstances, the contract still needed to be fulfilled. Yes, it was a hardship, it might have been an inconvenience for the cinema company to keep buying these films which they had contracted for, especially since they no longer had the audience for them. But after all, that is what they contracted for, and it was still perfectly possible to produce those videos and to show those videos or those newsreels in the cinema. Now we come to the case that devised this three-part test, Davis Contractors and Ferrum. As noted earlier, the court agreed that without default of either of the parties, there was a radical change in the circumstances, namely that in the post-World War environment, all of a sudden labor became a lot more expensive and materials were difficult to source. However, it was not impossible to fulfill the contract on the part of Davis Contractors to build those houses for the council. It was just more expensive. It was an inconvenience. It was a hardship. It was also material loss. It was all those things. But it was not impossible, and it was not a thing that was totally different that had been contracted for. In fact, building those houses is exactly what was contracted for, and nothing changed. Hence, Davis contractors lost the case. Let us move on to categories of frustration. So, we now know what the test of frustration is, and we apply the 3 parts of the test in order to deduce whether something is in fact a frustrating event or whether it's not. If it is a frustrating event, it falls under one of these 5 categories. The first is that the subject matter is destroyed or that it ceases to exist. And obviously, we know this from Taylor and Caldwell, where the music hall burned down. The second category is frustration of purpose. That is where the contract serves a certain purpose, such as in Crellin Henry, that was one of the coronation cases. The purpose of the contract was to watch the coronation, and since the coronation was cancelled, that was no longer possible. So we have frustration of purpose. Third, incapacity or death. Here's a case we haven't discussed yet, Robinson and Davison. In Robinson and Davison, Robinson contracted with Davison for Davison's wife to perform at a one-off piano concert. Davison's wife became seriously ill and was not able to perform. As the concert had already been scheduled, Robinson suffered losses and he sued Davison. The court held that Davison was not liable because the contract had been frustrated by the wife's illness. We can contrast this case to 2 cases which we discussed under the heading of breach of contract, Poussard and Spears, as well as Bettini and Guy. Recall that in those cases, there were also musical performances involved, and the performer became ill. Here, the similarity is perhaps with Poussard, where the opera singer also fell ill and was not able to perform. In Bettini, of course, Bettini only missed rehearsals, not actual performances. So let's concentrate on Poussard. What's different then between Poussard and Spires on the one hand, and Robinson and Davison on the other hand? Well, the difference is that in Robinson and Davison, this was a one-off recital. There was only going to be one performance on one evening, and that was going to be that. So either it would take place or it wouldn't take place. In Poussard, there were many performances scheduled. In fact, the contract was to run on for several months. So, of course, the issue of termination became a very important one, because if you've got a sick opera singer, you cannot let the opera proceed, or, as what happened, you need to hire someone else to do the job of the person who fell ill. Now, in Robinson and Davison, that was not an issue because this was only a one-off performance. So, ultimately, incapacity or death may lead to the invocation of the doctrine of frustration. Fourth, we also have frustration by change in the law. In Bailey and de Cresbigny, a landlord had promised a tenant that there would be no building works on the land which was subject to the tenancy. However, what followed was a legislative act which allowed a rail company to install some buildings on that land. Thus, the contract between the landlord and the tenant was infringed by the actions of the railway company. However, this infringement did not amount to frustration because there was a change in the law and there was nothing the landlord could have done. Similarly, in Denny Mott Dickinson and James Fraser, Fraser contracted to buy wood from Denny. However, due to the outbreak of World War II, the government issued the Control of Timber Order, which made it impossible for Denny to supply Fraser with the wood as previously agreed. This contract too was frustrated. It was frustrated because there was a change in the law. Lastly, there's also frustration by delay. In Pioneer Shipping and BTP Tioxide, a case which we've already discussed. There was frustration by delay because the contract between the two parties, which was a charter party, the charter of a ship, could not be performed as the ship could not be loaded, and the ship couldn't be loaded because of the strikes at the docks. So again, we've got a frustrating event here, this time frustration by delay. What then is the legal effect of frustration? Historically, the courts have found that losses should lie where they fall. This means that everything that happened up until the point in time at which the frustrating event occurs stands, and with the frustrating event, the contract comes to an end. So, for instance, if one of the parties had paid a deposit, the deposit would not be recoverable. If the other party, the party who had received the deposit, had already gone about building something or preparing something or setting something aside, such as in Chandler and Webster, another one of these coronation cases, where someone had rented a premises to be used to watch the coronation, that party would also be stuck with whatever losses they may have suffered, but of course they may keep the deposit, so it might not be too bad. However, this situation was widely criticized, and it is not entirely satisfactory, because sometimes you may have large losses on one side and no losses on the other, and this may lead to claims of unfairness. The law was subsequently changed in the Fibrosa case, which we've already discussed. That case meant that monies were recoverable even when there was frustration, however only in a very limited type of circumstance. You will recall Fibrosa was the case of the Polish company who had ordered a machine from an English company. The Polish company had put down a deposit, and the English company had started assembling the machine. They were never able to send the machine, or any part of the machine, because World War II broke out and trade between the two countries became impossible. The Polish company then wanted to recover its deposit. The court held that in the circumstances as they presented themselves in that case, it was possible to recover the deposit, but only because there was a total failure of consideration. That means the English company never sent anything to Poland. But of course, they couldn't have, because the machine had to be assembled first, and the whole machine was then to be sent. If the contract had been for a part of a machine, or for the machine to be sent in parts, and they had already sent one part, then there wouldn't have been a total failure of consideration, and the deposit would not have been recoverable. That too may not be the most satisfactory outcome. Again, it might be that the English company, or it might be that the Polish company, gets stuck with the bigger share of the losses. Therefore, some jurisdictions have statutes in place to allow for recovery, including expenses incurred before any frustrating event. But in as far as the common law is concerned, we are guided by the Fibrosa case. So let us now summarize this lecture on frustration. The doctrine of frustration was established in Taylor and Caldwell. That was the case of the music hall that had burned down. Previous to this, there was no doctrine of frustration, as exemplified in the case of Paradine and Jane, where the land, which was the subject of the lease, was occupied by the military, and yet the tenant had to pay the lease. The Taylor and Caldwell doctrine of frustration was further developed in Davis Contractors and Ferrum, where the courts came up with what is commonly known as the radical change in obligation test. This test has three limbs. First of all, the frustrating event must have occurred through no fault of either party to the contract. Secondly, there must be a radical change in the circumstances. Third, there must also be a radical change in the underlying obligation to render performance under a contract. There are 5 categories of frustration. That means there's 5 types of scenarios where a frustrating event may occur. And generally, as we learned from the Fibrosa case, recovery of money is allowable, but only when there's a total failure of consideration.